Hello, my name is Dr. Laurie Lee, and I work with the Regional Educational Laboratory, REL, Southeast at Florida State University.
Hi, my name's Dr. Kevin Smith, and I'm also from the REL Southeast. In our jobs, we help teachers, especially content area teachers, in the Southeast learn how to better teach literacy skills in grades 4 through 12. When content area classes like English Language Arts, Social Studies, and Science incorporate evidence-based literacy practices into their instruction, it may help students build their literacy skills.
Today, our goal is that you will understand how using evidence-based literacy practices can help students better comprehend text that is difficult to understand. Teachers can use these practices to help students access complex text that is fiction or nonfiction that is used in grades 4 through 12 classrooms.
Recommendations included in the Improving Adolescent Literacy, Effective Classroom and Intervention Practices Practice Guide, published by the Institute of Education Sciences, help teachers know what needs to be included in literacy instruction. These practices have been summarized in the Improving Adolescent Literacy infographic that we will share with you today. The infographic also contains activities to help us see what the recommendations look like in action. We'll share those with you too.
The recommendations that are included in the practice guide and the infographic are these. Provide explicit vocabulary instruction. This makes sense because if we don't understand the words in the text, we can't comprehend what it's about. There are several ways that we can figure out the meaning of unknown words and ensure that unfamiliar words become part of our vocabulary. We'll talk about vocabulary instruction, what it looks like, and we'll share an activity. Provide direct and explicit comprehension strategy instruction. Sometimes when text is difficult, we need to have some tools in our toolbox to help us understand it. As good readers, we may reread sections, read more slowly, write notes in the margin, summarize the text in our heads as we read, and use other strategies to help ourselves comprehend. Provide opportunities for extended discussion of text meaning and interpretation. One way to ensure that we understand text is to talk about it. When we discuss a passage, whether it be fiction or nonfiction, we gain insight from others and we hear others' points of view. That helps us to understand the text more deeply. And then increase student motivation and engagement in literacy learning. When we care about what a text says, we're more likely to make an effort to understand it. This is especially true when text is difficult. For instance, if you want your driver's license, you'll study that manual so you can pass the test. You have the motivation. Now, Dr. Smith is going to share a little bit about the structure of the infographic, and he's going to lead us in our first activity.
So, the Improving Adolescent Literacy infographic can be found online at the REL Southeast website. Here you see the home page, which displays the recommendations that Dr. Lee just talked about. Each of these is linked to a separate page that summarizes the recommendation and the steps to implement it. The specific pages also include an activity using a science text to demonstrate how each recommendation could be incorporated into instruction. The text used for context in the infographic is Stranglers of the Tropics and Beyond, which is an article published by the National Science Foundation. Dr. Lee and I are going to begin with a recommendation that addresses student motivation and engagement because that's where we need to begin when we introduce a text. Motivation and engagement are a little different from one another. Motivation refers to the desire or reason to read a text or become involved in a task, but engagement refers to the degree to which we actively use prior knowledge and strategies to process text deeply. Students need to be both motivated and engaged in order to understand the text they're reading. Here you see the recommendation for motivation and engagement and the steps for carrying out that recommendation. We're going to focus on providing a positive learning environment and making literacy experiences more relevant to students' interest and everyday life. You also see a description of the activity that can help motivate students to read and to help teachers gain an understanding of background knowledge that students may have to help with engagement. This involves presenting a hook question that is interesting and relates to the topic of the text students will read. The article that provides context for this infographic is Stranglers of the Tropics and Beyond, and it has to do with lianas, an invasive vine, the damage it does, and how it's spreading north. So, Dr. Lee, let's talk about a question that generally relates to that topic. Dr. Lee, can you tell me a little bit about the kinds of invasive species you know about, and do you think they've had little or much impact in our state?
Well, Dr. Smith, I've heard about a few animals and plants that are in Mississippi that are invasive species, that they weren't originally here, right?
That's right. If a plant or animal is invasive, it means that someone brought it in either intentionally or by accident.
So, well, I've heard of wild hogs. I don't think that they were in Mississippi from the beginning, and I've heard that they eat all kinds of things. They tear up people's yards, and sometimes they have diseases.
That's right. That's a good example. Can you think of any plants that might be invasive?
Well, I've heard of honeysuckle, specifically Japanese honeysuckle. I heard that it was brought here on purpose because it was really pretty and they thought it might help with erosion, but it's really gotten out of control. It's a vine that tangles around plants as it grows and it smothers those plants.
Dr. Lee gave a good example of an invasive animal and an invasive plant. That gave me a good idea of what background she has. Can you think of any invasive plants or animals? You may have thought of these or others. Kogan grass is an invasive weed that animals will not eat. Not even goats will eat it. It has no native competition or consumers, so it overtakes grassy areas. It was introduced to the U.S. in the early 1900s near Mobile, Alabama as packing material of plants from Japan. Chinese tallow trees, which are sometimes called popcorn trees, these damage the native ecosystem and are highly invasive. Those trees came to the U.S. in the 1700s and spread from South Carolina. Asian carp were brought to the U.S. in the 1970s to help control plankton, but they're dangerous to native species of fish, and they can fly right out of the water and smack fishermen on boats.
Yikes! Thank you for helping us get motivated to read our article, Dr. Smith. Now let's look at the recommendation to provide explicit vocabulary instruction. Content area texts oftentimes include specialized vocabulary, jargon, and discipline-related concepts that we don't encounter in other places. If we don't understand the meaning of the words in the text, then we can't understand what we're reading. Vocabulary instruction includes showing students how to use word parts and context clues so that they can become independent learners. It also involves providing students with multiple exposures to words so they can learn them deeply. Here you see the recommendation for providing explicit vocabulary instruction and the steps for carrying out that recommendation. We're going to focus on using repeated exposure to new words in multiple contexts and giving sufficient opportunities to use new vocabulary in a variety of contexts. You also see a description of the activity that can help students visualize the changes in meaning between two related words. This activity is called a linear array. Teachers determine the anchor words, which are two words with opposite meaning, and then list words that should be ordered in between those two words. I'll show you my thinking as I complete a linear array. Here I have two words, hot and cold. They are opposites of one another. Then I have several words that I'm going to arrange between these two words. So it's a continuum. I have cool, chilly, lukewarm, boiling, scorching, and tepid. So I'm going to think about these words and arrange them so they go from hot to cold. Now I'm going to start, I think, with the word in the middle. And I'm struggling between lukewarm and tepid. Neither one of these are really hot or cold. I think, though, that I'm going to put tepid in the middle. And I'll put it down here, and we'll kind of go in a V. Okay, so if I put tepid in the middle, then I'm going to think about what's really hot and what's really cold. Well, my hot words, I have boiling, I have scorching. Those two words. I think I'll put, to me, boiling seems a lot closer to hot because I know that that's like 212 degrees. So that's super hot. And then I'm going to put scorching after that. And here I have two words that are closer to cold. I have chilly and cool. And I think if I'm chilly, I'm not really comfortable. And so I think that's close to cold because I know I'm not comfortable when it's cold. And then cool, it seems like it's not quite as close to cold, because when I'm cool, I think I am comfortable. And so I'll put cool here. And then because lukewarm has actually the word warm in it, I'm going to put it on this side of tepid. So my continuum goes hot, boiling, scorching, lukewarm, tepid, cool, chilly, and cold. So Dr. Smith, there's my linear array. Do you have any thoughts on how those words are ordered, and if you'd make any changes?
You know, Dr. Lee, I think you did a pretty good job overall, and I agree mostly with what you have here. There's one change that I might argue a little bit with you on, and that's boiling and scorching over here. So in my mind, boiling, yes, it means that the liquid's got to 212 degrees. If something's scorched, that means that it's actually gone past the point of boiling and has actually turned into a solid and stuck to the side of whatever it's on. So in my mind, I might change those so that it's hot, scorching, then boiling. I really like the rest of what you've done and don't have any questions about those. So what do you think?
Okay, I understand your thinking, and I could agree that perhaps scorching and boiling could be changed the way you thought. So thank you for explaining that to me. Okay, so now we've seen a linear array. I've given you an example of my thinking as I created the array. And so now let's try the linear array that is provided in the infographic. So I again have two anchor words. This time, these words come from the article, Stranglers of the Tropics and Beyond, scarce and abundant. And so I have these words that I'm going to order in between them. Occasional, sufficient, plentiful, ample, infrequent, rare, and irregular. All right, as I think about these words, I think about plentiful, and that sounds very close to abundant to me, so I'm going to place it there for right now. I might change my mind later, but for now, that's where it's going. Occasional. I think that's somewhere down here in the middle. I'll make that decision in a couple of minutes. Rare, that's definitely scarce, so I'm going to place that right next to scarce. Irregular, I think that's down here towards the middle, so I'm going to place it there. And then infrequent, I think, is going to be closer here to scarce as well. Occasional, I think that's closer to the middle, so I'll place it there. Ample, definitely closer to abundant. And sufficient. Sufficient to me is more towards the middle as well. If you have enough, it's not abundant, but a resource isn't scarce either. So I think I'm happy with the way that I've ordered my words. So Dr. Smith, do you have any thoughts?
I have two words that I might have a little bit of a quibble with you on. Nothing major, but just something to think about. When I look at ample and plentiful, in my head anyway, ample has a shade of meaning that means it's a little bit beyond plentiful. They both mean more than enough. But in my head, because ample is less frequently used, it has a little stronger meaning closer to abundant than plentiful does. What are your thoughts about that?
I see your thinking there, and I'm comfortable with that. I could switch those words, no problem.
Okay. The other one that I really want to change is irregular. Irregular, that whole prefix IR means something's not right or something's wrong with something. So irregular means it's not happening as regularly as it should. So in my mind, that's got a negative connotation. So I'm going to move it closer to scarce. And I'm probably going to put occasional closer to the middle and irregular closer to scarce. What are your thoughts on that?
Okay. So I'm okay with that. In fact, as I think about what you just said, should irregular go even one more? Should it go up here?
I didn't think of that. I think you're right. I think that irregular is actually a little stronger than infrequent. So I agree with that move. Thanks. I really like the way these words are arranged now.
Okay, let me just read and we'll make sure. Abundant, ample, plentiful, sufficient, occasional, infrequent, irregular, rare, and scarce. So we've talked about the importance of ensuring students are motivated and engaged, and we've discussed the importance of vocabulary instruction. So now let's move on to the next recommendation in the infographic, which is providing direct and explicit comprehension strategy instruction. Comprehension strategies and routines, as well as procedures, are used to help us make sense of text. Sometimes we do these things in our heads, like when we reread or we slow down our reading rate when we read something that we realize we didn't understand. Sometimes we have tools to help us, such as a graphic organizer. Teachers should provide explanations of strategies as they model them, vocalize their thinking as they use them, and provide opportunities for practice. Ultimately, students should know what will help them when they encounter difficult text. So here you see the recommendation for providing direct and explicit strategy instruction and the steps for carrying out that recommendation. We're going to focus on showing students how to apply strategies they are learning to different texts and using direct and explicit instruction for teaching students how to use comprehension strategies. You also see an example of a graphic organizer that can help us organize our thoughts. Teachers review the text first on this graphic organizer, and they decide on some key concepts, some components, or categories that they want their students to understand as they read and after they're done reading. Students read the text and they take notes that relate to each one of those categories. They write down their notes, check the appropriate box, and then record the paragraph where they found their notes. This provides some support for students, but allows them to do the work. Okay, let me share a couple of notes from the article, Stranglers of the Tropics and Beyond. The article talks about how temperature, sunlight, and nutrients in water have all been factors in the growth of lianas. As I read the article, I found in paragraph 11 that the text says that increased competition from lianas for above and below ground resources limits tropical tree growth and survival. I think that pertains to both sunlight and nutrients in water, so I checked both boxes. I also found in paragraph 24 that a major factor limiting liana abundance in temperate forests is freezing temperatures. This obviously relates to temperatures, so I checked that box. Dr. Smith and I have also taken some additional notes. Dr. Smith, could you share a couple of the notes that you have and a little bit about why you thought that they were important?
Sure, just a couple of quick notes. So I had some of the same notes that you did. I had a lot of notes that went around with the idea of strangling. So the lianas overtaking the trees that they're growing on, which aligned with sunlight, because in most cases they were blocking the sunlight from the trees that they were on. There were also some that had to do with nutrients and water, not as many, a couple, because they also were able to siphon off some of the nutrients and water from the plants. I had many that dealt with temperature, the whole and beyond, the warming climate, the cooler temperatures that lianas don't grow well in. So I had more notes for temperature and sunlight than water and nutrients, but there were pretty solid notes for both of those categories.
Well, that's great. So you can see how this works. A graphic organizer like this can be used with all kinds of text to help students organize their thoughts. Teachers should model their use at the beginning so students understand the purpose and how to use them.
We talked about the importance of ensuring students are motivated and engaged. We've discussed the importance of vocabulary instruction, and we've talked about providing direct and explicit comprehension strategy instruction. The final recommendation included in the infographic is providing opportunities for extended discussion of text meaning and interpretation. Having a high-quality discussion that focuses on the meaning and interpretations of text helps us comprehend text more deeply. Effective discussions provide students with the opportunity to engage in sustained interactions with the teacher or with one another, present and defend their interpretations and points of view using the text, background knowledge, and reasoning to support their ideas. They should also listen to the arguments of their peers and be able to respond with reasoned thoughts and counterpoints. Here you see the recommendation for providing opportunities for extended discussion of text, meaning, and interpretation, along with how to carry out the recommendation. We focus on all of these components in the activities shared in the infographic. These include careful preparation by the teacher, asking follow-up questions during the discussion, using a format that allows for small group and whole group discussion, and ensuring that protocols are in place to promote a respectful and organized discussion. You also see on this slide a description of how a facilitated discussion might look, which includes an example using Stranglers of the Tropics and Beyond as the basis for the extended text discussion. The slide contains the teacher planning piece. However, the infographic also contains information related to student preparation and teacher facilitation. If we were having an extended text discussion after reading Stranglers of the Tropics and Beyond, we might pose the question, what factor of liana growth has most significantly impacted natural selection? We've already taken notes related to temperature, sunlight, and nutrients water. Students would be asked to discuss in their small groups which of these they believe to be the most significant factor based on the evidence in the text. They would be instructed to come to a consensus. The teacher would then take account of how many groups decided that temperature was the most significant factor, how many groups believed that sunlight was the most significant factor, and how many groups thought that nutrients water was most significant. Students would be instructed to go back to the text and find as many notes as possible that validated their position to be prepared to present their case. The teacher would then facilitate the discussion, allowing one group to present their case and then allowing opportunities for other groups to provide a rebuttal. As the discussion was coming to a close, the teacher would then take another vote to the groups to see if any minds were changed. Dr. Lee, there's only two of us, but let's model what a discussion like this might look like briefly in a small group. So I mentioned when I talked about my notes before that I thought there were pretty strong notes for temperature and sunlight. You've read this article. What are your thoughts between those two categories?
I have. I think I'm going to go with sunlight. And I found in a couple of paragraphs in the text where it really noted that the ratio between the leaf, the canopy, and the stems was such that the lianas really produced big leaves so it could gather a lot of sunlight. And so in doing that, then that helped the plant to thrive. If the plant doesn't thrive, there's no way that it can threaten others. There's no way that it can threaten other species, right? Because without those big leaves to gather sunlight, then it really can't grow and it can't spread. I also saw another paragraph that had to do with a hurricane in Florida where some of the trees were destroyed. And so the lianas took over. And then when they took over, again, those big broad leaves helped the plant to gather sunlight. So I'm going to go with sunlight.
All right, well, we're going to have to disagree because I'm going to go with temperature. I feel that sunlight's not a bad answer. I had a lot of notes for sunlight, but I feel the whole point of the article was Stranglers of the Tropics and Beyond the Tropics, meaning that as the climate warms, the lianas are kind of taking over northernmost areas, and that was a lot of my notes, how these are spreading into Florida and other places even further north, like New Jersey, where they weren't before, because things are heating up and they're able to survive. Where the freezing temperatures would have killed them off, because that's a big factor in their growth. They used to just live in the tropics, and now they're beyond that. So sunlight definitely plays a role. I don't want to discount your point, but I really think the point of the article was that temperature is playing the biggest role in this factor of changes in ecosystems.
And I do understand what you're saying when you refer to temperature, and there was a great deal of information regarding temperature in the article for sure. That said, I really come back to sunlight because, again, if there's no sunlight, if the plant can't gather sunlight, then the rest of it doesn't matter. It can be as cold or as warm as you like. It's not going to spread if it can't grow to begin with.
Now, say there haven't been any changes in sunlight to my knowledge in the last who knows how many million years, but there are changes in temperature. So I'm going to stick with temperature. But I see where you're coming. If there's no sunlight, there's no temperature
there you
living.
go,
So
right?
I get what you're saying.
Okay.
It's a chicken and an egg argument. So we'll just have to agree to disagree. But I appreciate your thoughts.
Okay. Dr. Smith and I have really enjoyed sharing the infographic from REL Southeast and that highlights those recommendations for improving literacy from the Improving Adolescent Literacy Effective Classroom and Intervention Practices Practice Guide with you today. As a reminder, those recommendations are to provide explicit vocabulary instruction, provide direct and explicit comprehension instruction, provide opportunities for extended text discussion and interpretation, and increase student motivation and engagement in literacy learning. This infographic can be found at REL Southeast at our website, or you can Google Improving Adolescent Literacy Infographic and you'll find it.
Dr. Lee and I would like to thank you for joining us today.
Goodbye.